Good evening, everyone. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome John Heilemann to the University of Chicago today for a live taping of the Axe Files with Institute of Politics Director David Axelrod. Mr. Heilemann's prolific career has spanned over 3 decades, and during this time his work has traversed a multitude of journalistic forms, including books, columns, television, and the internet. He is a national affairs analyst for NBC and MSNBC, and has previously written for The New Yorker, The Economist, Wired, and Bloomberg Politics, to name a few. He also co-authored the best-selling books Game Change and Double Down, which are widely heralded as 2 of the most influential accounts of presidential campaigns in recent history. Last year, Mr. Heilemann co-founded The Recount, an online media outlet that remixes traditional news coverage into bite-sized videos. And on top of this already formidable experience, he also serves as a host, executive producer, and creator of the television documentary series The Circus, in which he pulls the curtain back on the Trump administration and, of course, the impending presidential election. Mr. Heilemann's exceptional career has established him as a leading voice in political journalism. His work has been imperative to our understanding of presidential campaigns, elections, and administrations, allowing us to slowly comprehend the otherwise incomprehensible state of modern politics. We are excited to have Mr. Heilemann join us today to discuss his 3-decade career as a journalist, the 2020 presidential race, and news of the day with IOP Director David Axelrod. Please join me in welcoming them both.
Thank you. John Heilemann, welcome.
They really like you here.
Welcome.
They really like you. Do you get that kind of applause every time you do
Only when I hold the sign up.
Okay, good.
Good. Welcome to Chicago. You've just been in Iowa, right?
I
came here to warm up.
I came directly from Des Moines. It is colder there than it is here.
Yeah.
It's really cold. It's really cold there. Last night I took a picture of the State House. It was -4, felt like -21. At about midnight. That's cold.
Yeah, nah, that's okay.
Yeah, I know.
You're in. But anyway, the irony of the weather situation is that we sit here on the day that the impeachment trial has begun, the arguments over the rules, and we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
But there are a number of senators who are going to be marooned in Washington, moored to their desks, silent by the rules, which is the worst punishment of all. And
for any United States senator.
Exactly, but
worse than death.
Yeah, but they had a last weekend in Iowa, and it was filled with blizzard and sub-zero temperatures, and crap the whole thing up.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
By the way, and thank you all for coming. I went to college at a different university in the Chicagoland, the greater Chicagoland area, so I'm always happy to come back, even when it's cold.
Yeah.
One of the things I do is I make this show for Showtime called The Circus, which we have just come back for our 5th season. Thank you. The one person who watches, thank you.
And the others who meant to.
Yes. And as we're doing this first episode of our 5th season, this is the very question that we've been confronting, which is, I think it's fair to say at the moment that there are really 4 indisputably plausible Democratic candidates in the field. The 2 progressives, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and the 2 moderates, Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden, and then Amy Klobuchar, who is kind of on the bubble.
Counting on Iowa to leverage her way in the race.
Counting on Iowa, and as you know, with the 15% threshold in the caucuses in that first round, she's sitting at 11, 12%. So the last 2 weeks for a candidate like that, who counts on feeling like a neighbor, being all over the place. She's been in 99 counties. You know, she was going to be a hustle candidate who in the last 2 weeks was hoping to close strong, get herself into the second round of voting, and then be potentially a second choice for a lot of those moderate voters.
Because in the caucuses, if other candidates
don't make the threshold,
then the second choices could come to you.
Right, and you look at that, not to get too far off the topic here, but you look at the group of people.
That boat has sailed, so
yes, we're going to be off topic all night. You look at the group of people who are under 15% right now. You look at Klobuchar, Booker's now out of the race, but Andrew Yang, Tom Steyer, there's about 15% of moderate vote that's out there that's committed to a candidate but whose candidate isn't likely to make the 15% threshold. So those people are going to be presumably looking at Buttigieg, Biden, and they would be looking at Klobuchar. So she was really relying on these last 2 weeks, and is not going to have them on the basis of the schedule that's been laid out today, even with the compromises. McConnell was trying to make this thing go really fast. Instead, it's going to be a little less than really fast, but it's still the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, it basically takes her out.
It takes out all three of them are going to be stuck in Washington for the next 2 weeks, all the way to
Michael Bennet.
all the way to caucus day. Michael Bennet, who was not probably going to make the 15% threshold, except in his home in Colorado, where maybe with his kids he could have cleared 15%. I love Michael.
Good guy.
I love Michael Bennet. I love Michael Bennet, but he's been spending a lot of time in New Hampshire. He's been spending a lot of time in New Hampshire. Let's put it that way.
The guy who watches the circus also likes Michael Bennet.
Yes. So I think she is the one who takes it the hardest on the chin. We were with all three of the senatorial candidates last night shooting. So Sanders, Warren, and Klobuchar all literally doing their last rallies before they were getting on the planes to basically say, we'll see ya, maybe not at all. Or they'll come back, they have 1 day off, they're able to come back and campaign on Sunday.
Yeah.
And then the Sunday before the caucuses. So I think, it's a really, among the many unprecedented things of the Trump era, this is one of them. Not just having a president who's going through the impeachment process in the middle of a re-election in the middle of a Democratic nomination contest, but these candidates having to deal with this thing, not just Trump as a factor, but what it means for their ability to compete. And, you look at Sanders and Warren, with a lot of very hard baked in support and very good organizations in Iowa, they might be able to kind of grapple with this by sending out a lot of surrogates, doing a lot of, remote campaigning. Amy Klobuchar's got a much harder problem with no money and not much resources on the ground.
So one of the ironies.
We dove right in here.
Yeah, I know. And I actually meant to say, normally on the Axe Files, we would explore your long, illustrious journey to the top of your profession.
And my criminal record.
Yeah, that would have been tops, but we did it already once.
Yes, we did.
In
Go back and listen to that podcast.
That is in the archives,
Yeah.
and so that stuff is in there. There are some things about your life since that I want to explore a little bit later. But given the fact that the impeachment began today, and given the fact that the Iowa caucuses are less than 2 weeks away,
Yeah.
we're probably
diving right in.
We have to dive right in.
It is the case that one of the many things I associate with Chicago is this is the first place where I ever spent a night in jail. And I spent more than one in the Evanston jail, I will say that.
All right.
We can talk about that offline
Fine, I don't
later.
even think we talked about that in 2016.
Well,
Let's explore that.
Didn't do your research.
So I think the records have been expunged. I'm not sure.
Yes, they have, actually, in my case, yeah.
On the impeachment, one of the
Yeah.
ironies is that the president bought himself an impeachment by trying to slow Joe Biden down. Now
Right.
he is probably, the fact that there's an impeachment trial these last 2 weeks may actually help Biden in Iowa, because he'll be there with relatively little competition from the three senators, at least. He and Pete Buttigieg should be advantaged by the fact that they can barnstorm the state while the others are pinned to their desks in Washington.
Right, they are the flip side of the Warren, Sanders, Klobuchar problem. They have this extraordinary opportunity now, which you would have paid money for back in 2008 to have your two of your main rivals pinned down and locked in a different state and giving you open field running. Buttigieg, I think today had 4 or possibly 5 events today, and they clearly see this as an incredible opportunity to have this big wide open lane where there's no competition in the state. Local media is going to be dominated by them as they go from place to place. And it's in the same way, or the obverse of the situation with Sanders and Warren, where they have a lot of very diehard support. Those people aren't going anywhere. I think the general consensus in Iowa right now is that Buttigieg and Biden have kind of the softest support. You really have 4 candidates. Any of them could come in first. Any of them could finish a disappointing 4th at this point. But the Buttigieg-Biden support all feels a little squishy. Buttigieg is a better organization than Biden's. Biden has a lot of residual affection in the state. And you feel in Iowa where they really, as you know, they take their role in this process very seriously. There are a lot of criticism being about the Iowa caucuses, but the voters there are very serious. They're very sophisticated.
Well, how do you feel about that?
How do I feel about it?
I mean, you know the argument, and I bet
Yes.
some people here would probably echo this, that it's an unrepresentative state.
Well, it clearly is an unrepresentative state.
And that they shouldn't play this role, because they will,
Right.
in my view, probably in yours, they will play the same role they always play. We're going to have a much different race on February 4th than we did on February 3rd.
Massively, and you know that you get as much attention. You win the Iowa caucuses, you get more attention, national, local, international, digital, traditional, than all of 2019 combined. That's the kind of boost you get if you win. So yeah, we will have a really different race. And I think because of the two home state, sort of semi-home state senators, Sanders and Warren, bordering New Hampshire, New Hampshire has been kind of devalued, so Iowa all the more important this time. I think that it is really good that we start this process in small states where you can compete without that much money. I think that a national primary or starting in a really representative state like California would mean that you would have to have a ton of dough to start, and I think that would disadvantage a lot of candidates. And it would give huge advantages to
I know
people
you're
like
a Californian. There are probably some people who would dispute that California is representative of the country.
I just meant demographically.
I see.
So I think that the national primary idea is a bad idea for that reason. I do think that if I were God,
You think God makes these rules?
yeah, yes, there's only one person more powerful than God, the Iowa Democratic Party.
Yeah.
I think it would be a good idea if you could really just control it, would be to rotate the early 4 states so that every 4 years, those 4 states are good. One state with a lot of Hispanic voters, one state with a lot of African Americans, one Northeast, one Midwest, they're largely white. If they rotated every 4 years so that you had a different number 1 state within that group of small states, that would allow you to get a more representative sampling of the electorate. It seems like that to me would always be like, they'll never happen, right, what I'm suggesting. But if you ask what I think the best system would be, having small states rotating so that occasionally South Carolina would get to go first, sometimes Nevada would, sometimes Iowa would, that seems like would be an okay system.
Yeah, I agree with you though on the basic point, which is it's the only place in the whole presidential process where candidates actually have to interact with human beings in the way that you would if you're running for some other office. After this round, it becomes much more of a tarmac kind of situation where you don't have that kind of interaction. And these people in Iowa take it seriously as they do New Hampshire. When I was a young reporter and covering the New Hampshire primary, I went with Ruben Askew, who is the governor of Florida. I'm sure that name is sealed.
How many people in this room know who Ruben Askew is? Hands up. Okay.
There he goes.
4 people, all over the age, all over age 100.
One of our young at heart audience here. But he went to the school, he spoke, high school, 15-year-old kid. I would go up to him afterwards and I say, well, what'd you think of Governor Askew? Very impressive, he said. I said, well, if you could vote, because you can't, would you vote for him? The kid was like offended by the question. He said, I haven't met all the candidates yet.
Right, yeah.
And these people take it seriously. So step back.
And that just to button that one point, I think one of the things you're hearing, this is why I think it's an interesting Biden-Buttigieg thing, because as these Iowa voters who do take take their role in the process very seriously, they're very sophisticated, they've seen it all, they've been in the middle of this or at a place of prominence for their whole adult lives, you do get a sense, the thing we've talked about for a year, we all have talked about, that Democrats are focused on who can beat Trump, that electability, we see it in the polling, the most important thing. You do get this sense as we get closer to the finish line that the combination of Iowans who take their role really seriously with the sense that the role is more important than ever because they all think beating Donald Trump is an existential imperative, that they are really part of the reason why half of the electorate in Iowa is still up for grabs and still saying, I have a candidate, but I'm willing to change in the next 2 weeks, is because they're really grappling with which of these people, forget about who I like, but which of these people really has the best chance to beat Donald Trump?
Which is why not being there is so damaging.
For anybody who's stuck in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So there is this theory that the whole Biden candidacy is basically predicated on what you just said, which is that ultimately people want someone who can beat Donald Trump.
Right.
And Trump in certain ways has helped Biden by identifying him, as I mentioned earlier, as the guy he fears, played into Biden's message. And there is the theory that there'll be this flight to safety at the end, and he will be the beneficiary of it. But then there is this issue of his performance, which is uneven.
Which has not been stellar.
I would say
sort of like Mike Murphy's performance on Hacks on Tap.
It's nothing like that.
Yeah. Not always the sharpest.
But he's always sharp. Biden, on the other hand, isn't. And, he has, there's this, what I call performance anxiety. He performs and all of his aides are anxious. And so, but he has, he's well known, he's very well liked, he's got, empathy in huge You wrote a piece about him, by the way, in 1986. Did you not? My researchers tell me this.
That's a
so
fact.
Don't deny it, because someone
That was the first time I met Joe
heads will
Biden.
roll.
I wrote it in the midweek magazine section of the Daily Northwestern in 1986. First time I met
Did
him.
you? Oh yeah. So you actually met with him?
Yeah.
Met him then?
He was just starting his presidential
What were your
campaign.
impressions of him then?
My impressions of him then was I liked him a lot. In fact, he hired me to work on the 88 campaign.
Yeah,
Like,
which never got out of
happen.
87.
Honest to God, I wrote this piece about him. I was very impressed. Maybe because I was a young and impressionable, but I was very impressed. And they offered me a job back in the days when, like, the Illinois primary, somebody thought it mattered, and they offered me this job as a junior staffer, and I said I would take it. I'm not sure I was serious about that, but I said yes. And then I went to Europe to mess around for the summer. And by the time I got back, the campaign was over.
Nothing like the committed campaign warrior going off to Europe.
I was young, and
So, but tell me what you
fully responsible.
see in Biden now as a candidate, and as a candidate particularly in Iowa, because my feeling is if he were to win the Iowa caucuses, he will almost, in my view, he is very, very likely to be the Democratic nominee. If he finishes fourth in Iowa, you're into a whole different kind of campaign, and it opens the door to the Bloomberg candidacy after the primaries. It creates a different scenario. So tell me what you see in him and the way people are responding to him.
Well, I think the thing that you just pointed to a second ago is the thing, we all, if we're honest with ourselves and we're open to learning, we all, even those of us who've done this a lot, you've done it more than I have, but this is my 8th cycle, so I've done it a fair amount. Like, you learn things, as time goes by. And I was as analytically bearish on Biden for all of last year and thought
You weren't alone in that.
Yes, but I thought the performance issues, that he was out of step with where the party is now. I thought, you could see that he was not on the top of his game as a candidate, and there would be ideological issues and other things. And it turned out that everything that I thought would go wrong went wrong, and yet he's still the national frontrunner.
Right.
And in many polls leading in Iowa, at the top of the pack and way ahead in South Carolina. So what's to learn from that? I think what's to learn from that, what I have seen in the year is that a talking point that we would all say, everybody likes Joe Biden. Turns out that in this environment, that people's affection for Joe Biden has been a tangible political asset, that in the way that people 4 years ago looked at Donald Trump, who were Donald Trump fans, and said, yeah, he says racist stuff, and he's politically incorrect, and he's this, and he's that, but he's, he speaks for me, or he tells the truth.
Yeah.
They made excuses for Trump's problems, his failures, his candidate misadventures. His supporters stuck with him no matter what, right? There's part of that with Biden where people just genuinely, it's obviously a totally different dynamic.
Joe being Joe.
It is a little bit, he gets a pass from a lot of people. You've seen him have bad debate performances, have a moment in almost every debate, except for maybe that one in December where there was at least one moment where you thought, if you were a Biden supporter, you thought, wow, like, I'm not sure I want that guy on stage with Donald Trump.
Mike Royko, the great late Chicago columnist, once said of the late Mayor Richard J. Daley that he never exits the same sentence he enters. And there was a little of that.
A lot, yes, yeah. A lot of that. But it turns out that over the course of the year, that what you've seen is that people just liking Joe Biden has mattered a lot.
Yes.
It's not a talking point, it's a real thing.
And what you hear is, and you probably have seen some of this, the most interesting interactions come not when he's on a stage, which is his least effective, but and people flock to him who have had grief and have had problems. He's like a mobile Lourdes unit. People come to be healed because he has extraordinary empathy.
Yeah.
And I read.
And that, in one sense, I will say, David Axelrod, famous for you want a remedy, not a what is it? What's the
a remedy, not a replica?
Remedy, not a replica, right? So
yes. What is the most obvious deficiency of Trump is lack of empathy
and humanity.
Yeah.
And you see it in Biden. So that, in many respects, they're similar, age and other things, but that quality is a huge thing, and you do see it. As you say, he's been in the candidate protection program a lot, and they've been afraid to have him out in a lot of events because they're afraid.
Handle him like a porcelain bowl.
Right.
In fact, we're still waiting for him, the only candidate who hasn't done the Axe Files.
I know, but you've been bitching about this a lot.
Every show.
I know.
Every show.
I know.
I'm just trying to help the man.
But they have, they're afraid. When I have occasionally been at an event where he's been working a rope line. And I've known him since 1986. I wander over, he looks at me, he will see me, he will smile because we've known each other for so long. And at that moment, the staff and the Secret Service and everybody in the world circles around to try to make sure that we don't actually have any communication. Because they're like, wait, he knows that guy, and he's a reporter. I'm not sure,
by the way, that that is a sustainable model.
Yes, I agree.
Because the farther you go in a campaign, the less you can hide from that kind of scrutiny. So that creates a level of anxiety. I will say on this empathy thing, I reread the chapters in that probably the greatest campaign book ever written, What It Takes, by Richard Ben Cramer on Biden. He had an anecdote in there about Biden running into someone in an airport, a young man who had AIDS. And this was 1987. It was then considered a death sentence. And Biden spent an hour with the guy. There was no, other than the guy writing a book, there wasn't anybody there to cover the thing. It was just an act of humanity, and that is something that...
At the core of Joe Biden, that he had not even suffered all of his various traumas and tragedies at that point when Ben Cramer wrote that book, and obviously he's gone through much more since then. So I do think you really see it. And the other thing, you see that. So the human connection, the empathy, the reservoir of affection that people have is a real tangible political asset, number one, and it causes people to excuse various failings that they wouldn't excuse in other candidates. The other thing is that there is an enormous amount of risk aversion in the Democratic electorate right now. The Democratic electorate is, on the progressive side is louder, more energized, more organized than in the moderate space, but the moderate space is bigger numerically. And in Iowa and elsewhere, people are so freaked out about what a second Trump term would mean that they are looking to Biden and thinking, in a lot of cases thinking, he's flawed in a lot of ways, but maybe he's the safest choice. They don't all think he's the safest choice for some of the reasons we're just talking about, but there's definitely a current of thinking among voters where you hear people say, he's a little too old, he's not fully on his game, but do we really want to take a chance with Kamala Harris or Cory Booker? Or do we really want to take a chance with Elizabeth Warren? A lot of them are, well, he has a slightly different set of issues, but because a lot of voters who would be open to Biden aren't necessarily open to Bernie Sanders. But you hear with Warren, the thing comes up when we touched on this in the last week with the Warren-Sanders controversy over gender. There is a quiet discussion going on among a lot of Democrats, not about whether a woman should be president, is qualified to be president, but is it a risk factor? We saw what Donald Trump did to Hillary Clinton. We saw the misogyny on display. Do we want to tinker with that or not? You hear voters asking those hard questions who are not misogynist at all in their outlook, but are so focused on winning and making sure that Trump doesn't get another 4 years, that they're factoring in things like that I've never heard voters think about in quite the same way, with the same kind of calculation that they are in this cycle.
Yeah, she was sailing along she ran an almost flawless campaign for about 10 months. And then hit an iceberg called Medicare for All.
And some candidates who decided to hold their feet to the fire on it, and some pundits who decided to try to hold their feet to the fire on it too. I recall you pressing her one. David's like, I'm not a pundit. What are you talking about? I recall after that debate in October where you asked her, you're a supporter of Bernie Sanders' bill, you're a co-sponsor, would you introduce it if you were elected president? She went, humana, 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 which was not a great look for her, I think.
And there were subsequent problems with it. What about this dust up with Sanders? The way I see this, and tell me if this is wrong, there are primaries within the primary here. You've got a battle for primacy on the left between Sanders and Warren. You have a battle for the sort of center-left vote between Biden, Buttigieg, and Klobuchar. It seems to me that for Buttigieg and Warren, they have to beat the principal, they have to beat the front runner in order to really propel themselves forward in this race. She has to beat Sanders in Iowa. He has to beat Biden, even if they don't finish first. They have to finish ahead of the person in their lane.
Well, you were pointing to implicitly to one of the things that is as always true, which is that we all have an interpretive framework. By we all, I mean anybody who interprets this stuff for a living. What the press sets as an expectation, what we consider a victory or loss. I'll come back to Iowa in a second about how I think, how that will work, because I just really codified a thought about this the other day that I had never really codified before. I do think that there is...
Where are you when you codify?
I'm in a state of constant codification. I'm codifying right now, and it's not the nicest things I ever thought when it comes to you.
Do you need a few moments alone?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good. I think that it's true that, so I think the Sanders-Warren fight, there's one moment that actually sunk in with voters, I think, which was her moment on the debate stage, was very good for her.
Yeah.
I don't think, if you did the inside baseball of it, I don't think she handled the whole thing particularly well. I don't think that various elements of it were particularly well executed on their part. But the thing that people remember, actual voters remember, is that she had that very strong moment on the debate stage where she turned a mess that was at least partly of her own creation into a very strong moment that resonated with a lot of women that I run into all over the place who said, God, she was great when she made that point about women candidates and their electability and how she and Amy Klobuchar had better win-loss records than the men on stage.
Yeah.
That hit. And when you saw this most recent Iowa
What about
poll,
the after party on the stage where she and Bernie had their little...
Well, again, I think that's the thing that cable viewers, I think, know about, but I don't think a lot of average voters are really as tuned into. The debate audience much bigger. And I was going to say that, David Binder, a person who did a lot of polls for Barack Obama, just had a poll, the most recent Iowa poll that came out just a couple days ago, yesterday. They do this poll for a coalition of agriculture interests.
Rural voters, yeah.
Rural voters in Iowa. And that poll was interesting for one reason, which was that a lot of people in Iowa, as we know, the last debate in Iowa before the Iowa caucuses, it's a national debate, it's broadcast everywhere, but Iowans were really tuned into that debate.
Like half of them said they saw it.
Right, it came through in the polling, how much they were focused on it. And you looked at that poll, and Sanders, who had seemed to have a lot of momentum in the previous two polls, the Register poll and the Monmouth poll from the previous week, Sanders suddenly in fourth place in that poll. And the guys who ran it said to me, they said, that a lot of people watched the debate and it did not help Bernie. And you really noticed that on the second choice question, Bernie was in fifth place, down at the bottom. So I think that Warren probably emerges as the winner from that thing a little bit. And I do think that with Sanders, to the extent that it felt like he had some momentum going into that dust-up, he's come out on the other side of it with less. And the fact that he's now creating this controversy by attacking Biden mercilessly, Iowa famously does not love negative campaigning. I feel like that right now, that whatever momentum Sanders seemed to have entering the new year seems to have dissipated and maybe even reversed a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think she pulled
I'm
not being judgmental, but that was a big league blackjack kind of move.
Yes.
And she benefited from it. It was ugly. It was not fun to watch, but she slowed him down.
She did. I think that's right.
So on the other side with Biden,
Yeah.
seems the question I keep hearing from Iowa, and this is the last question on Iowa, because the fact that the President of the United States is on trial for impeachment seems worthy
of our consideration, yeah.
Yeah, but one of the questions is just in a caucus where you have to go and stay sometimes for hours, declare yourself in front of your neighbors, often on a very cold night. Enthusiasm and organization means something.
Right.
There are questions about, as you point out, the enthusiasm of Biden's crew, and it seems to me that he may be as interested in the meteorological reports for next Monday, or for Monday the 3rd, than he is polling at this point, because he needs his people to come out.
He does, and there are a few things that I think people believe generally, in Iowa. One of them is that the turnout's going to be really high. You guys set the record in 2008. People assume kind of broadly that they're going to break that record.
Be higher this time.
And be up at 250 or north.
Yeah, right.
And I think, most people would say that a giant turnout like that.
Not good for Biden.
Not good for Joe Biden, who's going to be more like the Hillary Clinton electorate, the older Democrats.
He's got 45% of the vote among older people over 65.
And not that many. They don't seem, because their organization is a little bit weak and because of Biden's characteristics, they don't seem to be generating a lot of interest among a lot of new voters, right? If there are new voters coming into the process, they're more likely to be Warren or Pete voters. And to some extent, Sanders voters. All three of those candidates have very good organizations. So I think it's a very good question about Biden, who is polling pretty well now in Iowa. A few months ago, he looked like he could have finished 4th or 5th, and he still could for this reason. Giant turnout, a lot of young people, a lot of new people flood into the Pete. Pete is generating a lot of enthusiasm that you see palpably at his events. The turnout for Pete events is bigger than any of the other candidates really right now. He's the little flavor of the month. So is it possible
Well, if
that
you're going to
Joe...
be the flavor of the month, probably January is a good month.
It's a good month to be. He's been the flavor of the month there for several months.
Yeah.
But I do think, so the ultimate answer is, I think, here's what I really think, is I think you've got really...
That's what I want to know.
All of these things are things that I really think, but here's the bottom line because you want to get off Iowa. You've got 4 candidates, all within the margin of error. Any one of them could win. Any one of them could finish anywhere else, except I think it would be hard to imagine Bernie finishing 4th, right? I think over time that it's true that the Iowa caucuses generate, really, the media is pretty simple, right? We can't really handle complicated stories, or many of them. And so you get really 2 stories out of Iowa, always. One is the who won it. Winner, it doesn't matter if you win by 6 votes or 6 delegates or half a percentage point, you're the winner of Iowa. That happened with Hillary and Bernie Sanders in 2016. She won by,
Right.
almost nothing, but she's the winner. The winner gets a lot of attention. And then the second story is who's the surprise. So either the upside surprise, they finished a surprisingly strong second, a surprisingly strong third, or
The
a
downside.
surprisingly weak
Right.
finish. Hillary Clinton in 2008. Oh my God, she finished 3rd, way behind, right? I think, like, my gut says it's possible that you could get 3 of these candidates who are all clumped up at the top with one very narrow winner and 2 people finishing in 2nd and 3rd close, and then someone turns out to be the surprisingly disappointing 4th. Like, you could imagine that in a way, and then the question is, who's that going to be? And I think you're right that a world where Joe Biden is like the disappointing 4th
That's bad for him, yeah.
could kill the campaign.
Yeah, well,
Do you think that's right? Is that possible?
I don't think it kills the campaign, but I think it
Mortally
it
wounded.
makes it may open the door to a long twilight struggle. That brings Bloomberg into it after the
Right.
Like my buddy Mike Murphy says, if you're the front runner and you're Superman and you can't lift the railroad train, that's a bad thing.
Yes.
So he has to lift the railroad train. Impeachment, we gotta talk about it.
Impeachment.
We all kind of assume that we know how it's going to end.
Yes.
And it's going to end sometime in the next few weeks. Does it matter what happens during those weeks relative to the commonweal? Yes. Either the president of the United States is going to be removed, or the behavior of the president of the United States is going to be, by implication, ratified, and it's going to embolden him and others in the future. So it's a big deal.
It's a big deal for the country. I think.
But in terms of the election, we are now in January. This will end in early February. What is the impact likely to be next November?
Well, I think probably, assuming that I don't think there's any dispute, right? The odds are, dramatically against Donald Trump being removed from office, right? It's not impossible,
Nothing's
not
impossible.
impossible, but
Yes.
very, very unlikely, right?
Yes.
I think it certainly will embolden Trump in ways that are
Good, because he's so reserved.
Yes. It'll embolden Trump, I think, in ways that are terrifying. The notion that the Democrats tried to take him out twice with the Mueller investigation, and then with Ukraine, and failed in both cases.
Yeah.
His emboldenment will be extreme.
Yeah, who will he call the day after that?
Yes. That's when you make the call to Kim Jong-un, right? But is that good or bad? For Trump, it's not clear to me that an emboldened Trump is a smarter Trump. Is their campaign better? Is it worse? It seems to me that the likelihood is, I'm sort of in the camp of some people who I think we both think are smart, people like David Plouffe and others in the party who don't see a landslide on the horizon for a Democrat.
Yeah, impossible.
Who think it's going to be a very close election.
It has to be.
The advantages of incumbency being what they are, Trump having all this money, having a real campaign this time, unlike in 2016.
Economy.
The economy being very strong, the investments in digital they're doing, the fact that he's going to be running unopposed while the Democrats fight it out in all these battleground states over the course of the next 6 months, all of those things. And there's a reason why we've had, for the first time in American history, 3 successive 2-term presidents, because
under a normal circumstance, you would say 70% chance that the incumbent gets reelected.
I would say under normal circumstances, if it wasn't Donald Trump, with this economy, you'd say that it was closer to 80%.
Right.
With all the other advantages of incumbency, which, as I say, I think are getting greater as time goes on.
Yeah.
That it's always been an advantage to be an incumbent, but I think it's greater now than it's ever been because of technology, because of the role of money.
But it is Donald Trump.
But it is Donald Trump, and so you have a coin flip election. Most likely, you have a very, very close election. in the Electoral College.
Yes.
Probably not a very close election in the popular vote.
Maybe a wider margin than 4 years ago.
Whereas, Democrats, people speculate on the possibility that Democrats could win. A Democrat could win by 5 million popular votes, rack up huge margins in New York and my home state of California and in this state, and yet still lose the Electoral College. And, the reality is there are these 5 now, I think, again, within the parties, a fair amount of clarity about the notion that Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the 3 states that carried it for Trump by 77,000 votes, plus Florida, which is the purest swing state in the country, basically a coin flip in that state, and then probably North Carolina are the 5 most contested states that we'll see. Trump will fight hard in New Hampshire, where he could, one Democratic state that he could claw into the Republican side. Democrats will fight hard in Arizona, but the rest are not really going to be in play. The Trump campaign, people will talk about Ohio and Iowa. Those are almost certainly gone to the Republican side. People will talk about Nevada and Colorado. Those are almost certainly gone to the Democratic side. So a very, very close election in the Electoral College. And is Donald Trump's emboldenment on the other side of impeachment, does that make him better, smarter, faster? Or is it something that, given our
Or more reckless.
Or more reckless? And does it, if the trial plays out over a long period of time, if we do get witnesses, for instance, could a John Bolton not lead to Trump being removed from office, but inflicting more political damage on the margin? Because that's all that matters at this point, on the margin. This close an election, it's not much that's going to make the difference between winning and losing. So a longer impeachment trial with damaging witnesses, could that hurt Trump a little bit? It could. Could a victory embolden him in ways that will make him a more reckless candidate? It could. I mean, I think when you're talking about this,
when you're out in the, do you
this
hear
close an
people,
election,
voters actually talking about this?
Impeachment? Hardly at all. Hardly at all. And I think the best way to measure, not that, I mean, everybody we know and everybody in this room cares a lot about impeachment, and if you press a voter in Iowa on impeachment, they will talk about it, and it's not that they're not paying attention, but it's really low down in their order ranking of priorities, and even with their order ranking, their priorities about Trump. You've been saying for a long time something I profoundly disagree with, which is you hear many people, profoundly agree with, I mean, which is this notion.
There's a difference,
I know. Well, there's so many things I disagree with.
There.
There's so many things I disagree with that this was the outlier. Is that people are just exhausted.
Yes.
And you hear it all the time.
Yes.
That people don't say to you, what I hate about Trump is that he tried to get foreign help with the Ukrainians to interfere in the election. What they say is, I'm so sick of the fucking tweets.
Yeah.
And the chaos.
Tantrums.
And the tantrums and the mess. It's so undignified. He's not trying to bring the country together. The president should be trying to bring us all together. He's just trying to divide us. Those are the things you hear from people. And the best metric of how interested people are in a deep way in impeachment in a state like Iowa or New Hampshire is that the campaigns are spending tens of millions of dollars to find out what those people are interested in.
Right.
And they are not talking about it on the campaign trail because they believe, on the basis of all their research, quantitative and qualitative, they believe that it doesn't benefit them to talk about impeachment in town hall meetings or in their campaign rallies. Bernie Sanders last night in Des Moines was talking about prescription drug prices, a lot about medical, a lot about healthcare stuff, and really about the economics of healthcare, a huge amount. Some about the banks, some about income and income inequality, some about other things, but Trump was really only raised in, I got to go back to Washington to do this impeachment thing.
Right.
And I think he knows his audience. He knows what those people want to hear.
So let's talk about him. You wrote a book that got some attention called Game Change back in 2008.
You were in that book that got some attention.
Yeah.
Game Change. You were.
That's how it got my attention.
Yes, I was going to say that. I believe the mention, there was a mention very quickly in the descriptive first paragraph about all the soup stains on your tie.
Yeah. That's such a cliche. I'm ashamed that you put it.
I like that you're not wearing it. Well, you used to also.
I don't wear a tie anymore.
I know. Good for you.
So the and then you wrote a sequel and doubled down in 2012.
In a more neat fashion.
We can move on.
Yeah.
2012, you wrote a sequel, and you were going to write one in 2016. Yeah. We'll talk more about that later. But in service of that book, you spent time with Donald Trump.
Yes.
So, I think you say people in this room care a lot about impeachment. I suspect people in this room and in this precinct have a very strongly negative view, mostly, of Donald Trump.
How many people in this room voted for Donald Trump? One.
All right, there's one guy.
Sir, I have security waiting for you to help you out at the end of the evening.
I admire you, sir.
I was going to say
for your courage.
I was going to say one Trump voter here by the standards of Hyde Park. This is a remarkably ideologically diverse crowd.
No, but here's that's true.
There you go.
Here's my question.
Yeah.
Explain his popularity explain what his particular political power is, because I think he is underestimated.
Yeah.
And
Certainly in precincts like this.
yes.
Like just as a pure political force, yeah. We did at Bloomberg, where I worked at Bloomberg Media in 2016 and did the circus and did other things. But one of the things we did very early in that cycle was a bunch of focus groups. And the first set of focus groups we did were we had voters in New Hampshire, where we got undecided Republican-leaning voters and Democratic-leaning voters. In the Republican room, this was maybe July or August of 2015. So Trump had been in the race for a couple months. In the Republican room, the first thing that you noticed was that the front runner, Jeb Bush, no one in the room was interested in Jeb Bush. Not one person. There were more people in the Democratic room interested in Jeb Bush than there were in the Republican room. And the second thing was that sitting in this room, when you talked about Trump, all of the reasons why Trump won were present in that group. People immediately, when you told them, you would say, he was for single-payer health care. He wanted to legalize drugs. He gave money to Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer. Everything you would say to them, they would make excuses. Well, that was then, this was now. He had to do that, et cetera, et cetera. The immediate instinctive thing was to make an excuse for Trump. That was the first thing. The second thing was they all knew who he was, had 100% name ID from the very beginning, and he was mostly synonymous with
The Apprentice.
and with the build shit. They'd seen his name on buildings. And so for these voters, it was like,
We've got one here.
he's rich, he builds stuff, he's successful, he's famous. And then the next thing, which was, he speaks his mind, he's not politically correct.
He's authentic.
And particularly not politically correct. The notion that candidates were constantly trying to tell them what they wanted to hear and were essentially lying to them, trying to cater to what they wanted to be told, and that they were focus group, scripted, poll tested, canned lines, and that Trump, even when he would say things that offended them, you had people in this group who would say, I hate that he said the thing about Mexicans bringing rapists and drugs into the country. I hate that. I don't like that. But I do like the fact that he's willing to say it means that he's not trying to flatter me or cater to me. He says what's on his mind, and that's missing in our politics today. And the other crazy thing in that room was people who would say, he understands my life, he's one of us, which is a Nixon thing. And of course, my first question was, so do you have a gold-plated toilet? Have you ever flown on a private...
Do you, sir, have a gold-plated toilet?
Have you flown in a private jet? Do you have a 13,000 square foot apartment on Fifth Avenue? All of them would say no.
But what does that say about, that's what they say, but what does it say about him? Because my view is that he has a kind of, he has a feral genius for understanding his market.
Yes.
He's a marketer.
Yeah.
And he has a genuine genius for understanding the modern media environment.
But I think all of that, part of what was going on was that I said what they said for a reason, which is that this notion of being able to connect to the populist sense, and particularly grievance, and when we open the door to grievance, you start talking about race and other things, but this notion of not politically correct really meant, he says stuff that you're not supposed to say in polite society, but that I really think. And that, we're now talking about the fundamental thing of Trump, which is that he was the grievance candidate. He gave voice to the frustrations, anger, anxiety of a lot of people, particularly a lot of white people who were very uncomfortable with the fact that you guys put a black man in the White House. And there was, in some ways, the history of this will be written, that the pendulum swing, that Trump is not inexplicable at all in the context of Obama. When we first saw it, we're like, how could it be? The first African-American president, followed by this guy who's a racist, nativist, xenophobe. Well, the answer is that they're perfectly connected. There was a giant reservoir of just below the surface racial resentment, anxiety, and animosity that Trump set free and capitalized on. Some of it driven by the discomfort people had with Barack Obama in the White House. Some of it driven by demographic change. The notion that the country was the fact the country was moving towards being majority minority, and people sensing economic opportunities slipping from their hands and being given to those people, the other. All of that stuff was just below the surface, it turns out, in Barack Obama's America, and Trump had an unerring instinct to get right in there and open that seam up and let it out and make it okay to not necessarily say some of those things out loud, but to be for Donald Trump, right? You could be a You didn't have to say racist things if you had some racist tendencies, racial animosities. You could get away with. You wouldn't have to say them out loud. You could just be for Trump because he said them out loud. And I think that was a very powerful thing, and it's still a very powerful thing in the country right now. We've, he's a candidate. When we look at these states and why they are going to be super competitive, because in Florida, there are now more non-college whites in Florida than there were as a proportion of the electorate in 2016. And all of these arguments about how demography was going to move all these states in the Democratic column, it will probably someday.
Yeah.
But right now, in a lot of these key swing states, the demographics are worse for Democrats than they were.
Demography may do that, then Secretary of States may move some of those people
back
off
the other
of
way. But a lot of those states are, when you look at the ratio of non-college whites to non-white voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, other places, they are very daunting demographies for Democrats. They're not moving the right direction. In the states where the demography is moving in the right direction, it's moving there real slow.
Right.
Not fast enough to make up for the challenges.
That's a problem for the Republican Party in the long term,
yes.
But in the short term it benefits.
Right,
So,
we're talking about 2020 right now, though.
Right.
Yeah.
You wrote a book about Bill Gates and Microsoft, and then you did a series in 2004 or something on the emerging
Of the internet. 2007, yeah, the series.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're a student. You've been a student of this for a long time.
Technology.
How has technology changed campaigning over the time that you've been covering it, and how much of that has facilitated Trump's rise?
Well, I think in three ways. One, starting with your campaign and then moving forward, the tools of technology that have allowed for a different kind of grassroots organizing have been super powerful in the hands of campaign professionals. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as a tool of fundraising, it is now the dominant way in which people raise money. In the old days of bundlers and donors, unless you're Mike Bloomberg, where you don't have to raise any money, everybody else now, the internet is where the action is in terms of raising small dollars. That's the tool by which it's raised. And then there's the media environment, where I think the prevalence of social media has done a lot of things to our conversation. Most of them, well, many of them horrible and toxic and negative, but they've also nationalized the election in a way. It's very hard now to do what your candidate did and what other candidates have done in the past, where you go and you run an Iowa race, and what happens in Iowa is not connected to other things. Now it's like the polling now moves in these early states kind of in sync with each other. With it, like nothing is really. There's no Iowa campaign anymore. There is on the ground, the organizing campaign, but the media campaign is now nationalized to a large extent. And for Trump, the ability to go over the heads of, or around the edges of the filter, the national filter, and have this direct conversation with tens of millions of his voters and another tens of millions of the bots that occupy his that are on his follower list on Twitter, has been an enormously powerful thing. And Trump, for a man in his mid-70s, it turns out, at least with respect to social media, he's adapted to that new technology better than, with more effectiveness, with more effect than any other politician ever.
Well, one of the things is if you're willing to be politically incorrect, and you understand that if you light yourself on fire, people will pay attention,
Yeah.
and you're willing to do it on a daily basis.
An hourly basis.
Yeah, but that is in some ways a perverse advantage in this system.
If you are one of the rare human beings who has no shame whatsoever, does not care like what polite society, what the liberal media, even the conservative establishment media, if you don't care and all you care about is getting people riled up and the opprobrium of society mean nothing to you, it's a very powerful thing to not care in the way that Trump does not care.
Do you, so as you sit here today, how would you rate Trump's chances of winning re-election?
I really think
You said a coin flip.
I think it's going to be super low. We don't know who the Democratic nominee is, so it's hard to make that call. I think there's,
Well, who do you think gives Democrats their best chance?
I hate these questions. Really, I hate them. I don't know. I'm gonna wimp out on this question because I think you might too if I pushed you on it, right? It's hard to, I'd like to see what
But it's
happens.
my show.
I know. Well, it doesn't mean I'm not gonna push you.
Yeah.
I think the thing that would worry me if I were a Democrat and I was looking at Joe Biden is that the race that Trump will run against Biden looks an awful lot like the race he ran against Clinton. And that Trump knows how to run that race, and that Biden will not have Trump as off balance as you would like to see Trump if you were.
As the candidate of the establishment,
Yes.
the status quo.
Yes.
Yeah. The one
And-
difference is that Biden does have a cultural kinship with some of those voters who are going to be on the bubble.
He does.
In a way that Hillary Clinton did not.
But think about the things where did Hillary Clinton fall short in 2016? She fell short with young voters in a very dramatic way. She fell short with African-American voters and other non-white voters in a pretty, at least compared to expectations, in a pretty dramatic way. It's not clear to me, despite Joe Biden's strength in this Democratic primary with African-American voters, that he's a candidate that's going to electrify the non-white segment of the electorate in a general election, number one. And there's no evidence whatsoever that he's electrifying young voters in the way that a Bernie Sanders does. So again, I'm not trying to say Sanders is a stronger candidate in general in the general election, but there are some things that would give me pause about Biden. But again, I look to the Trump campaign. I think the Trump campaign, the best evidence that Biden is the strongest candidate is that Donald Trump seems to think he's the strongest candidate. And I don't think I don't think his position with respect to Biden, trying to hobble him, trying to cripple him, trying to get the Ukrainians to do all those things, and we should probably still talk about impeachment, but a little bit more, but I don't think he would do all those things. He's not doing those things just on instinct. He's doing those things on the basis of data. And I think in Trump's world, where they are very data-centric now and running a lot of numbers, I think they believe that Biden would be the strongest general
He's also
election
trying to get a little edgy about your old boss, Mike Bloomberg,
Yeah.
who is running an experiment we've never seen in American politics
Right.
before. Probably will spend $500 million before Super Tuesday on March the 3rd.
Just a little bit south of your salary at CNN.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't believe they disclosed that. So we don't know exactly what that will produce, and it seems to me he does need Biden to falter. How do you evaluate that? I mean, my thing would be Trump should be happy. Bloomberg's infusing so much money into the economy that it might actually make Trump stronger.
Yeah. I think that, the thing I most admired about Mike when I covered him in 2008, 2012 when he thought about running for president, working there in 2016 when he thought about running for president, and then again at the beginning of this cycle, every single time, for a guy with as much money as he has, he was always a rationalist. He was like, he only wanted to run if he was going to win. He spent tens of millions of dollars to discover through a lot of research and data that he couldn't win, and so he didn't run every time. And now this time he decided to get in the fall, and at first I thought that mortality and age or whatever had overtaken him, and he decided to do an irrational thing. I now think he was not irrational because I think he recognizes that he has a very small chance of winning and decided to do it anyway at the moment when
And do you think he's building, they've signed people to contracts through the end of the year.
Yeah.
They say he's going to hang in there whether he's the nominee or not. And do you think that he will do that? Because he has the resources to be a real problem for Trump.
I think he definitely wants to get Donald Trump out of office for sure. I do think there's another thing in the middle of it, so to go to the rationality point. I think they are all very acutely aware. Mike Bloomberg and the people who work for him, many of whom we know are very smart people. They recognize that with spending enough money in enough big states, you can get to 20% of the vote, 22%, California, Texas, maybe not Texas, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Illinois, right? You're not going to get, I don't think that anybody thinks he has a chance to win the Democratic nomination outright. There's one scenario that they're playing for, which is a car crash in the first 4 states, no clear front runner.
Right.
You get to the March states, and Mike is able to get enough delegates not to become the nominee, but to keep anyone from being able to get to 1991, which is the number of delegates you need to be the Democratic nominee. And then you go to the convention, have a contested convention where you stand up and say, I am the only one who has the money to take on Donald Trump on a level footing. And then it's a coin flip or a jump ball really in Milwaukee. Could Mike emerge in that? We don't, I mean, it's such a crazy scenario that maybe.
Yeah.
And I think that's their only play is the contested convention play, because he can't, just starting this late and throwing money at the problem, he can't get to 1,991 delegates. So that's a long way of saying, to getting to your first question, if your strategy is contingent on a contested convention, and you know that most Democrats, hearing that you are trying to force a contested convention, are going to hate you, because a contested convention is a nightmare for the Democratic Party. Not having a nominee until July, horrible. probably consigning the party to losing to Trump, right? So what have they done to blunt that criticism? They've said, we're going to spend all this money in the battleground states, we're going to deploy all these people, we're going to fight to the end and get rid of Donald Trump, whether or not Mike is the nominee. And I think that is more of a defensive thing. It might be real, but it's partly an answer to people in the party who are going to start going, wait, Mike's trying to force a contested convention? And they have to be able to say, well, sort of, yeah, that's what we're doing. But it's all going to be good for the party anyway, because we're going to deploy so much money and so many paid staff in all these states. It's their way of answering the criticism that's coming, I think. If Mike decides to really do it, you know, it's maybe the only thing financially that
Would offset
that
what the
will
Republican-
offset what Trump's financial advantage. I mean, obviously, Mike's worth $50 billion, you know, and that is well north of what you're paid by CNN. And he could spend $10 billion without really missing it.
Lunch money.
Lunch money. You know, the passbook savings rate on $50 billion is a lot of dough.
Yeah.
So, you know, he could be a huge factor if he decides to, if he doesn't get the nomination, if he decides to stick and play.
John, I just want to ask you a few. I said I was going to talk about your life. I want to ask you about a couple of things that have happened since the last time we sat down. Some of them really good, some of them not so good.
Okay.
One of them was your wife, Diana, had a struggle with a really serious cancer last year. And I remember when you first told me about it, the outlook looked very grim.
Yes.
And then a miracle happened. And just tell me how that whole experience for you and her went and how it impacted on you.
Yeah, so my wife, Diana, who is an amazing, amazing woman, and is roughly basically my age. We've been together since 2002, and she was healthy as could be. And at the end of 2018, she seemed to get a little sick. And then we discovered in January of last year that she had this very rare cancer, this liposarcoma, which is one of the rare, like genuinely hugely rare thing to get. And it was sufficiently bad that we had to make some very hard decisions in January about how to try to deal with it. None of which were, there were a couple of courses of action. Neither one of them was guaranteed success. We decided to pursue a pretty radical surgery that if it worked, she would be cured and cancer-free, and if it didn't work, it would be a really brutal surgery, and we would be kind of in the same places where we started out, rather than going down the path of chemotherapy. And we, an amazing surgeon at Columbia Presbyterian, a guy named John Chabot, who's the head of the pancreatic cancer unit there, and my wife did not have pancreatic cancer, but because of the nature of her tumor, which was laying right on top of the head of her pancreas, this guy was the right guy to perform this surgery that the people at Sloan Kettering and other places said was too dangerous to perform. And making that decision, one of the things people talk about each other's medical situations, I think is a really boring topic in general, but there was a couple of really important things that we learned about it. The bottom line was she did this surgery. It was pretty risky. It was wholly successful, and she's now cured and cancer-free and doing great a year later. But what I learned from the process was that I'm the worst asshole in the world when it comes to health stuff related to my friends and family, and because I'm a journalist and because I have the ability to get the right people on the phone pretty quickly, given my aggressiveness about it and the people I know and things I can get right. I'm like one of the lucky people in America who can get these things done when so many people in the country. I was really made aware yet again of how fucked up our healthcare system is, that for any person going through these kinds of processes without resources, without wherewithal, just how screwed you are in America. I was able to get us in a situation where we were really like looking hard at these two options. And there's an amazing cancer doc out of USC whose name is David Agus, who runs the Center for Transformative Medicine that's funded by Larry Ellison and is one of the great cancer diagnosticians in the world. Someone I had known for about 30 years before we got into this. And David, when we got down to the choice between doing a brutal regime of chemotherapy that had a very little chance of working but might have shrunk this tumor enough to make it operable, or doing this operation that didn't seem like it would be successful, but that if we could pull it off would be the best thing to do, we didn't really know what to do. and it was like it was a decision that we couldn't, on the rational analysis of it, you couldn't come up with the right answer. There was no right answer. And David Agus, who now is my wife's doctor going forward, he said to us, there is no right or wrong answer here. They're both scientifically valid. They're both risky. They both have upsides and downsides. He said to Diana, he said, what did you think of Dr. X? And she said, I didn't really like that doctor, who was the person who wanted to pursue the chemotherapy option. Very, very well-respected expert in the world of sarcomas in the world. And then he said, what do you think of John Chabot? And my wife said, I really loved him. She told a story about how they had really connected, and we have dogs, and he had a dog, and there was all this kind of emotional stuff that had happened with this doctor. And David Agus said to us, he said, well, that's the path you're going to take now. And I said, well, why? On what basis? He said, well, it turns out that one of the things we've learned over the course of 40 years in modern medicine is that your attitude about your treatment has a profound impact on the likelihood of success of the treatment. Like empirically speaking, not just like airy-fairy new age bullshit, but like you are more likely to have a positive outcome if you are comfortable and confident and believe in your path than if you are nervous, scared, and full of anxiety about it. So if you have a connection with this doctor, there's not a question of what the right or wrong path is. There is your path and there is the other path. And it's the one thing that I learned from this process that turned out to be profoundly true, because given everything that was involved in this operation and then my wife's recovery, which was long and arduous, believing in this doctor, I think, was a hugely important thing. And it was interesting to learn that there's empirical data that backs that up. So, I think a lot of people face these choices at some point when they go forward in their lives, and it's something that I will keep in mind for the rest of my life.
You look at life differently now as a result of this experience?
Yeah, I mean, we've both had this experience with our respective spouses without getting into your Susan situation, but I think everybody, one of my partner on the circus, one of my partners, Mark McKinnon, his wife Annie,
also went through it.
His wife Annie also had a cancer scare about a decade ago, and he wrote this piece afterwards that was called "The Gift of Cancer." And I will say, my mother died had cancer and died when I was 20 years old, and I've had cancer through my adult life in various ways. That being the most profound, and the idea that you could write a story called "The Gift of Cancer" struck me as absurd until it had affected my wife. And on the others going through this, I really came to understand what Mark meant, which was that the thing of going through an experience that makes you realize what is really important. If you are ambitious and you work really hard and you do things in your life and you care a lot and you're a workaholic and you're doing all the shit that I do all the time, to have a thing where it's like, wait, I might be without this person, in relatively, it seems like the most banal thing to say in the world, but nothing focuses the mind like the prospect of a hanging at dawn. And in this situation, it was very palpable for us. It was very palpable. It seemed quite likely or possible that I would lose my wife in the immediate short-term future. And I think it was transformative for me, not that I'm a better person in any way, but it was a really, really powerful reminder to try to remain focused on what really matters and what matters a little less, and to try to every day remember what really matters and to stay focused on it and not let some of this other stuff that is important on a variety of other dimensions. And I would never, my work is important to me, politics are important to me, the fate of the country is really important to me, but there's nothing more important to me than Diana, and that this was a thing that reminded me of how lucky I am to have her, and of how important staying focused on that and appreciating it every day is. I don't think I would never want to go through this. It's not a thing I would wish on anyone, but it is something that in some weird way was good for me and good for us in a way, in terms of reminding us how important we are to each other.
Yeah.
And how to try to live every day like it really counts.
Things more important than the circus.
Yes, and more important than Donald Trump, as important as I say, the fate of the country.
Yeah. I don't know if he'd accept that, but okay.
No, I'm sure he would not, but I'm sure you find this, right? People walk up to you occasionally and say, how are you? At least in New York where I live, this happens all the time. How you doing? I say, I'm great, or I'm okay. And people go, how can you possibly be okay?
Yeah, right.
Donald Trump's president. You should be fucking miserable. This is terrifying and horrible. And how can you possibly be okay? And I, look at them and say, it's really important. And a lot of people's lives are affected, and there are kids in cages on the border, and there are terrible things that Donald Trump has done. But, the truth is that I think it's right and proper that there are things that are more important than politics for all of us, and as important
Amen.
as politics are.
John Heilman, thank you so much. I want to say to the production, the production staff, that I know that I ran over, but I also know that when we started, the clock said 53, so I grabbed a bunch of my time back. So you can't fool me. And I apologize to all of you for taking a couple of extra minutes here. Please, your question.
Hello, I'm Alexis. I'm a first year in the college. Thank you so much for being here. I want to actually bring it back to Iowa. So, as you said, there's this scenario where you have a lot of candidates who are really close in numbers in terms of supporters. So, I want to know, and I haven't heard a lot about this in the media, but how do you think the satellite caucuses that the Iowa Democratic Party is hosting this year will affect that? Do you think there will be any effect on the caucus results?
And we should explain that there are going to be satellite polling places like all over the world, I think in 3 countries and all over, probably around here.
2 in Chicago.
2 in Chicago. Are you an Iowan?
No,
Oh, I see.
I'm a journalist.
Oh, I see.
You could be both. So false binary.
So, and they will be filtered in, and so the question is, what impact will they have?
I don't know. It's not the first time they've done satellite caucuses. There were some in 2016, so it's not a totally novel experiment. There's more of it in this time around. It is still a very small proportion of the ultimate caucuses, and I don't really particularly think there's any reason. Maybe David will tell me I'm wrong about this, but I don't think there's any particular reason to think that those caucus sites will behave in a way that's at variance with the way the rest of the state does. I mean, all the caucus sites, any given caucus site, you have different variances. Some of them are, behave differently because they're in a college town like Iowa City, or they're rural and they have different orientations. But I think, it'd be hard to disaggregate to say that somehow, in some fundamental way, that you could put down someone's victory or loss, or that given what a small percentage.
They represent about 10%, I think, in total.
Yes, so and I think there's no reason to think that they're going to be, that like the caucus, that they will be an advantage to one candidate or another. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's not like, well, because the caucus sites, because of the satellite caucus sites, that this candidate will have an advantage because one of them, has more connections to Tbilisi, Georgia, which is one of the places that there is a satellite caucus coming from. So, it's interesting, and I think it's great. One of the biggest criticisms of the caucuses is that it's because it happens on one specified night and at a particular time, that there are people who are either shut in or immobile or whatever. There are various reasons why a caucus is not as democratic as a primary, in the sense that primaries, you get early voting and all the things that make it more accessible to people who have various constraints in their lives. So I think anything that Iowa does to make it easier to be part of this process is a good thing. I don't know that I think that it would be impossible to predict at this moment that somehow that it could be a thing that will have a measurable effect on the outcome.
All of these results will be communicated by smartphone, so what could go wrong with that?
Yes, right. The app is going to work out incredibly well,
Thank you.
sure.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Murphy. I'm a second year in the college. You mentioned earlier that in 2016 there was this sense that the Democrats were just a series of rehearsed sound bites, and people didn't think that they were very genuine when they spoke about issues. Do you get a sense that that's changing in the 2020 election cycle?
I want to be, if that was the impression I gave, it's wrong. What I meant was, what I think I said and was trying to convey was that I think there's a broad sense that it's not just Democrats or Republicans. It's that
Politicians.
Politicians in general, people are, that there's a perception that Democratic and Republican standard establishment politicians are all full of shit. And I don't think that's changed.
Yeah. No, I think that is true. I also think that, Hillary Clinton was a very practiced politician in that way. Her answers were very calibrated, and it seemed like there was a 7-second sort of tape delay through which she passed the answer through a kind of political computer, and a lot of politicians are like that. And the contrast with Trump was pretty significant in that regard. There is no filter there for Trump. It's right from his id to his fingers to his tweet. So
But I think that's true. Wouldn't you say this is right? That I think over this notion that it's certainly the case that most people in the country think that Washington politicians are bad haircuts with a lot of rehearsed lines, and that the notion that Washington and Washington politicians are full of shit is a pretty pervasive sense.
Yeah.
And I think that it's part of why in recent cycles, in a way that wasn't true when we were younger, that this notion of authenticity as a maybe the ultimate coin of the realm,
leading indicator.
right, is a thing that people now prize in a way that, because there's a perception that so many of the rest of them are full of shit, that if you can have that thing where you feel as though we have a candidate who comes across authentic, there is nothing else to explain Bernie Sanders better in his appeal to young voters, something that a lot of people in 2016 did not anticipate happening. You looked at Bernie Sanders and said, you know, he's got dandruff on his jacket, and he comes across like a cranky old man like Larry David and Curb Your Enthusiasm. How could that guy be successful at all, let alone be successful be the candidate of millennial voters? And the reason it turned out was that they were like, yeah, he doesn't have any of these practice candidate skills, but he's been saying the same thing for 30 years. He seems like he really is speaking what he really believes to be true. The fact that he comes across as rough and gruff is actually an asset rather than a liability. And I think it's the more that people think that Washington and politicians broadly defined are full of shit,
right.
the more that authenticity becomes a thing that you can't buy, you can't bottle it, you can't teach it, you can't learn it. It's either you have it or you don't have it. And a candidate like Barack Obama, I would say a candidate like George W. Bush, in fact,
Yes.
people don't want to hear that, but these
No.
candidates,
They were more authentic than their opponents.
yes, they're much, if you lay
More
George W.
comfortable with
Bush
themselves.
next to Al Gore, there were a lot of people who just looked at those that thought Al Gore phony, George W. Bush was more real in the eyes of a lot of voters.
Yes.
Obama, who felt more authentic than Hillary Clinton and certainly John Edwards in 2008. And I think that is a thing that turns out to be an enormous advantage in a world where the sense that people have that professional politicians are just consummate liars, frauds, and phonies, it's a huge advantage to be not seen that way.
Thank you.
Now, is Murphy your first name or your last name?
First.
So you're not related to Mike Murphy? All right, good.
Yeah, she asked a very intelligent question. She seemed polite and kind, unlike Mike.
My name's Hyatt Allen. I'm a second-year dual degree student doing a Master of Divinity and Master of Public Policy here at the university. My question's about the Electoral College. You guys talked about the possibility a bit for a 5 million vote difference. What are your thoughts on getting rid of it, changing it, something that seems to be more and more that needs to happen since we've had 4, maybe 5 elections that have had a popular vote winner that was not the electoral vote winner?
Yeah, before you should answer this question. We should just point out, there are a lot of models that would show this race coming down to a tie or a one electoral vote difference, depending on how Wisconsin goes and half of Maine. So it's going to be a long and interesting night on November 3rd. So if you've made plans, factor that in. Go ahead.
I think that there's, the notion that the Electoral College needs to change or be abolished or be adjusted, I think is more currency now than any time in my career. And the fact that there have been now this succession of elections in which the person who gets the most votes doesn't win seems a little fucked up, and people seem to be, you hear more about it in the same way as you hear more now about trying to get Iowa out of the pole position in the Democratic race. It's more bubbled closer to the surface. The likelihood of it changing, and maybe I will be proven wrong about this, but the likelihood of it changing anytime soon seems close to zero.
And explain why. I mean, the system that would be required to change it is to amend the Constitution
is very hard to clear.
Would involve 2/3 of the states, legislatures in 2/3 of the states, and the smaller states are not going to surrender their power here. I think it's an interesting discussion, but under the Constitution, very.
Well, there is the interstate compact method that is being thrown around a lot, and I don't know how much momentum it has currently, but it did 4 or 5 years ago when I was looking at this. So.
Yeah, no, I still think it's
Yeah.
It's highly improbable. And, you know, it is problematical because we've now had 2 presidents elected in the last 2 decades with fewer votes than their opponent. We're almost certainly, if Trump were to win this time, we'd see the same phenomenon. We also have, you know, a majority in the Senate that represents less than a majority of the population. And, you know, we had presidents who were not popularly elected who have supplied 4 members of the Supreme Court. And it creates tension in our democracy for sure. You know, these are challenges for our leaders, and you know, you could have leaders who are trying to bridge those divides, and you have leaders who could exploit them. We're going through the exploitation phase right now.
I mean, I find it infuriating. So,
Yeah.
I mean, infuriating, and just, you know, if you spend any time abroad, I mean, it is one of the things about the American system that causes everybody who lives in another advanced democracy in the world looks at our system and says, like, what's up with you guys? Like, that makes no sense whatsoever. Yeah. You keep getting presidents who are not the will of the people is being thwarted. So I find it infuriating, but I think on a practical basis, David's right. I think it's very unlikely to change in our lifetimes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, the people have spoken, but we don't care is not a good way to go in a democracy.
Hi. How to combine the notion that Donald Trump is a genius, as you discussed, genius politician that doing everything correctly, and short sentence from Rick Tillerson, who said that he's fucking idiot?
Yeah. To be clear, I'm virtually certain that neither David or I would say that Donald Trump is a genius in any overarching way. Certainly not a genius, and certainly not someone who I think has done everything right. Quite the contrary. I think or may not be familiar with my work.
No, I know, but you politically genius, you say basically.
Yes, yeah. I think David was asking a very precise question. I don't mean to be picky about it, but I think there are certain respects in which Donald Trump, he's been a genius at I think he was a genius at channeling what I referred to before as being a sense of the wide sense of grievance among many voters about various economic and cultural factors, channeling that in a way that allowed him to do something that a guy who, and again, I think he's a terrible president, I think he's unfit for the office, and I think he's committed impeachable offenses, and I criticize him loudly every day on television. The reality, a guy who had no political skill whatsoever, had never run for anything before, had never raised any money before, had no campaign to speak of whatsoever, staged a hostile takeover of America's second oldest political party from a standing start, became the nominee and beat the most qualified person, arguably on resume grounds, ever to be a major party nominee in the country, and pulled it off by losing the popular vote by 3 million and still winning the Electoral College. There is a kind of crazy-ass genius to that. It is a very unlikely thing to have done. And so I say that not to say Donald Trump is a genius, but to say that guy picked the lock. And I think the real genius of him was to recognize that the Republican Party was so hollowed out and bankrupt that it could be taken over by a hostile populist force and go over and take a party that was, at that point, was really a shell of itself. It, it was a Trump-leal party. It was like, the Republican Party at that point was, to see that someone, a renegade force like that, could move in and say, I'm going to take over this party, all the things that it believed in for the last 40 years, I'm going to render them all rubble, and now be in a position where you're the most popular person in the history of that party. Again, I say, there is a kind of genius to that.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks more, I'll just finish the last thing I'll say about this. I think all of that speaks more to Trump's sense of, he's an incredible opportunist. And I think what he saw, the genius of it was that he saw an opportunity in the weakness of this party. Trump is not the problem. He is the symptom of a problem, and a symptom of a problem in the country, and a symptom of a problem in the world where populism and nationalism and racism and xenophobia are alive and resurgent in a lot of Western democracies all over the world. He saw that this Republican Party could be toppled in the way that he did, and I do think in that sense he is very much the cause. He's not the cause, he's the symptom of the problem.
But he's navigated it skillfully.
He has.
I just wanted to make that one point. This is not an American phenomenon. If you look at the Brexit vote in Britain and overlay it on the Trump vote here in America, it looks very much the same. older, less educated, more rural, small town folks who have been white, who have been on the wrong side of these very rapid economic changes. You know, the constituencies, and who feel culturally estranged from the metropolitan elites.
Right.
It's the same phenomenon, and it's global. It's not just here. But he very skillfully manipulated it. I got time for one. Thank you. I've got time for one more question, and I apologize to you guys.
You could ask after it's over. Just walk up here. We'll have a little private seance.
Hello, my name is Emily. I'm the first year in the college.
Are you from Chicago?
I don't know if the accent gave it away.
I was wondering, I really
If I had known that somebody who had this accent was in the audience, I would have asked you to come up here and replace David. It was much more pleasant to listen to you than listen to that.
Thank you. I don't know.
I really enjoyed reading Game Change and Double Down, having been 7 and 11 when those elections happened. I wasn't really aware
Okay,
of
now
them.
you got your
I know,
comeuppance.
seriously. It's the most painful. That was like really, I just got giant kick in the ass right there. Yeah.
I was wondering whether you're planning on writing a similar kind of book for 2020, and even if you're not, do you anticipate that reporting on selection will be different to those based on the Democratic primaries and the fact that Trump is the incumbent? Sorry.
Sorry, what was
Are you gonna write a book this
I got
year?
that part. What was this? I
No,
lost the last. The end of
whether
it.
you expect that that reporting on this campaign as we enter 2020 will be different compared to previous reporting based on
Right.
the Democratic primary and Trump.
Yeah. I really find writing horrifying and painful, but that doesn't mean I won't ever do it again. So I think there's a really great book to be written about the 2020 campaign, and stay tuned on that front.
Oh man, titillating. Does the reporting you do for the circus, and I should point out, and I will in the introduction to the podcast, you have this great new thing called The Recount, which
Yes.
is this very smart 5-minute digital
Video
every day. Are you collecting string in the off chance that that the muse may kiss you on the ass again?
I don't. It would be foolish for someone who has spent their life as a reporter to spend as much time in the field as I do now without collecting some string. Let's put it that way. So I think I think there are a lot of people writing books in the campaign that I know of. I think there are some very good people writing books in the campaign. I think Trump is an incredible subject. And what's at stake? I mean, I think David, maybe you'll tell me if I'm wrong about this, but. You don't believe this, but we all say, this is every election. It's the most important election of our lifetimes. This is the most important election of our lifetimes. And I think most people, and I think the left feels that and the right feels it as much as the left does, that like there's a huge amount at stake. If you are a Trump fan, this is, you'd say this is a war, a war with cosmic existential stakes. And on the left, obviously people think that if Trump has another 4 years in office unconstrained by politics, having defeated 2 attempts to impeach him, what he will do. I mean, I can't tell you the number of Democrats who say that another 4 years of Donald Trump, the country will be rendered unrecognizable on the other side of it. So the stakes are really high, and I think that any journalist worth his salt is not. I want to be clear about this. I don't mean energized by Trump, but I think a lot of people in my business are doing their best work right now because they think the stakes are very high. The New York Times, the Washington Post have been doing as good work as they've ever done in this administration because people are trying to rise to the challenge and trying to take this seriously. They're under attack also by the administration, and so they have rallied and done amazing work. And I think it's true in television as much as it is in print. And so I think that there will be, given the number of people that are writing books on this campaign that I know of, and others who I'm sure I don't know of, I think there'll be there's some great literature to be written about it. There have been some very, very big books written about the Trump administration. There's now the new one, the Phil Rucker, Carol Leonnig book that just come out, which I think there's 2 great reporters who may have written a book. I've not read it yet, but the book seems to be fantastic. There have been a number of other books that have been less good, but still revealing in various ways about Trump that have sold insane numbers of copies. So there's an economic incentive for people to do this work too. So I can't imagine we're not going to get a couple of good campaign books. When we set out to write Game Change,
people said the campaign book was dead at that point. No one had done a book, a successful book on a presidential campaign, really going back to Hunter Thompson. It had been 25 years since anybody had done a book, 30 years, since anybody had done a book that had been commercially and critically successful in a presidential campaign, to the point where, amazingly, that it was spring of 2008 before Game Change even was a thing that I was involved in. It was like, because no publisher wanted to publish a book just on the 2008 campaign. You thought, like, it was nuts to think that like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, like you would have thought there would have been a bunch of projects, but people had become so convinced that in the nonstop news cycle, social media, cable news, all that, we'd heard it all, you'd already heard it all, you know, and the failure of previous campaign books made people think that it was a dead enterprise, basically. And that people don't think that now because there have been some successful ones since then. But I think we will have books to feast off of in this campaign. And if you think that, you know, one of my favorite campaign books is Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, and part of why that book is so brilliant is that it had in Nixon such an incredible character for Thompson to be pushing off of. He focused mostly on the Democratic race, but Nixon was out there as the foil throughout the book. And Trump, I think, if you were to take a literary stab at doing this campaign, the reality of the stakes of it and the sense that all these Democrats are kind of trying to grapple their way towards, you know, a competition not just to win a nomination and win an election, but in some way to restore America to what a better version of itself. Not that the country's ever been perfect, because it's always been imperfect, but that there are a lot of people out there in the country who are like, can we please get back to something that's like the America that we once were? There's a lot of that sentiment out there. So all of these candidates trying to reach for that, which is, again, not just your normal, hey, I want to be the nominee, I want to win the election, but also there's the giant existential, spiritual, psychological, and political stakes involved. And if somebody can't write a great book out of that, you know, I'd be very surprised. I think
so. I'm going to pick through that hail of words, and I'm betting he's writing a book. Thank you for your question.
Does that sound like
Thank you.
That sound
Thank
like a
all of you.
filibuster? That sound like a filibuster.